That's right. Did you all hear what Chip just said? I had asked, who would be opposed to the idea of a presidential library? Who would be opposed to Franklin Roosevelt's idea of creating a library in a place that had been important to him, putting it in Hyde Park, so that when people went to study his administration, they would have not only all of the archives of both him and his aides and his wife, all of the important archives in order to look at that administration, but they'd also be around buildings and places that had been important to Franklin Roosevelt. They'll be right by the Hudson River, that was the river that he looked upon when he was a child. They'll be by the house that he grew up by. They'll be around the cottages that he built, one for himself, one for his wife. They'll be able to see some of the things that belonged to him, his stamp collection, his car, and by being in this atmosphere, Roosevelt reasoned, they're going to be able to better understand him. That'll create better scholarship. Most importantly, we're going to have a way to protect presidential papers so that what happened so often in the past won't happen, because they're all going to go to one place. So who would be opposed to this? Well, as Chip the Poodle has said, of course the Republicans are opposed to this. The opposition party is opposed to this. Now, the Republicans already feel that Franklin Roosevelt is among the most self-aggrandizing presidents in the history of the country, and to them, this is yet another example of him trying to obtain his part in the books, in the history books. And of course, that is part of what the presidential libraries do. Right now, the Lyndon Johnson Library is doing a 3-day seminar about civil rights. And this is part of their director, Mark Updegrove's attempts to create a better understanding of all of the laws that Lyndon Johnson passed and all of the effect that Lyndon Johnson had. So the libraries are going to be part of this presidential scholarship. That's true. For those of you who think partisanship has only started recently, you would be surprised to look at the history books. Obviously, there have been some very partisan times in our past, certainly when Thomas Jefferson was running against John Adams, and certainly when Franklin Roosevelt was president. Many people were opposed, not only people in the Congress and the Senate, but citizens, to anything Franklin Roosevelt came up with. And this was one of those examples that created a lot of people who were saying this is a terrible idea. Now, I know there's been some writing on this subject. Let's see, is it Henry Adams? No. Dumas Malone? No. Doris Kearns Goodwin? No. David Herbert Donald? No. Oh, here we go. David Cross. Here's his book, Chasing History. If you're interested in this book, and why wouldn't you be, you can go to chasingthepresidents.com, where you can purchase a copy of this book. But in this book, I discuss some of these people who were so opposed to this presidential library, and some of them were just citizens. One lady writes this letter. This is Clarence Boothby from Chicago. She wrote, "The decent citizens of this country are not at all interested in perpetrating your memory to future generations. In fact, we are only anxious to forget the stench of your egotistical, incompetent, unscrupulous, and unspeakably costly administration as quickly as we can get you out of office. I suggest you sell Hyde Park and give the money to the forgotten men you prate about so much and then exploit, and let us forget as soon as possible the one who caused all this mess." Another lady sent in what she wrote in the check, only 10 cents, and wrote in there, probably due to the recession. So we have some people having some fun with this, and the Wall Street Journal, too, wrote a cartoon in which they showed Franklin Roosevelt as Santa Claus, filling up stockings for who but Franklin Roosevelt, saying, "Oh, won't he love this?" More seriously, there were people in Congress who said, this is a terrible idea, because if Franklin Roosevelt does this, every president's going to do this. And then, instead of having one place where people can go to study history, the Library of Congress, you're going to have places all across the country. Now, an interesting thing that was going on back then was that one of Franklin Roosevelt's greatest legislative enemies, his greatest legislative enemy, was Hamilton Fish, who was from his own district. So the library would be going into his district, obviously helping his district economically. Nonetheless, he led the battle against it. He said, if we do this, if we let him have this library, every president's going to have a library. They're going to be all over the country from Squadunk to Podunk. And it's going to cost people too much money to drive around. And they all argued about this. They all argued about, is it right to let Franklin Roosevelt create this memorial to Franklin Roosevelt? Is it right to create this burden for scholars who are going to have to drive all over the country? Initially, the Republicans were able to stop passage of the bill. It was required that it be 2/3. Now, Sam Rayburn was able to do a parliamentary trick and switch it over, so all they needed was 51% majority. So there was never any question that the Democrats were going to be able to get that through under that rule. However, there were still some fascinating debates, fascinating arguments that were had about whether or not we should have this presidential library. Well, eventually it came through, it passed, and there was going to be allowed a presidential library. And Franklin Roosevelt's vision of having a presidential library in Hyde Park, right by his own home, was going to be initiated. And he was ready to sign the bill in order to make it law, but there was still one problem, one person who could stop him: his mother.